Managing Violence Podcast, episode 80 with Tommy Joe Moore. We're talking about his new book, The Shanghai School of Streetfighting. Fight Like Your Grandad with Tommy Joe Moore. Coming up on the Managing Violence Podcast. The Managing Violence Podcast is proud to be partnered with Fuji Sports. Fuji Sports manufactures the highest quality of judo, jiu-jitsu, and MMA gear. Everything from gis to rashis, shorts, gloves, pads, bags, mats, finger tape, everything you could possibly need for training. I've personally been a customer and supporter of Fuji Sports dating back to my very first BJJ gi in 2007. Since then, they've been a go-to brand for me, whether I was chasing judo gear, BJJ gear, MMA gear, or just convenient bags to carry everything around in. The gear I wear to Krav Maga training now is actually a Fuji Sakai. It's one of the most comfortable and most durable gis I've ever owned, and yes, they even come in black for the ninjas in the audience. As a listener of the show, simply enter the discount code MVP10 at checkout for 10% off your order, and a percentage of the sale will also go to the show to keep us on the air. Savings for you, commission for us. What's not to love about that? MVP10 for 10% off at fujisports.com or fujisports.com.au for the Aussies. Some exclusions apply. Thank you, Fuji Sports, for years of high-quality gear and for supporting the show. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Managing Violence Podcast. As you just heard in the intro, we are delighted to welcome a new partner to the show, Fuji Sports, both in the US and Australia, working on Europe as well. Europeans, hold tight. We're working on a deal for Europe as well. But right now, if you want to get some high-quality martial arts gear from Fuji Sports, enter the coupon code MVP10 for a discount. My name is Joe Saunders. Welcome to the show. It is our mission here at the Managing Violence Podcast to equip the protectors, whether you are protected by trade, protected by family, protector because you just have the sheepdog instinct of wanting to protect those around you. Welcome to the show. I hope you get tremendous value, not only from this episode, but from everything in our back catalog. Also, a reminder, if you're new here, that if you head on over to patreon.com/managing violence, there is a whole bunch of bonus content. And the bonus content from this episode is a little bit different. We're actually going to get a tour of Tommy's SOE weapon collection. Have a look at some of the weapons that spies during World War II were carrying. It's quite an interesting little video tour that is available to our Patreon contributors at patreon.com/managing violence. All right, without further ado, I'm going to get straight to the content. Patreon.com/managing violence, buy me a coffee /Joe MVP, and buy my book on Amazon, Neon Jungle, Bounces, True Tales of Lessons, Laughs, and Lacerations. All right, no more plugs, I promise. Here it is, Tommy Joe Moore. All right, I'm joined here on the Managing Violence Podcast once again by Mr. Tommy Joe Moore. Tommy, thanks for joining us.
Hello, pleasure to see you again, mate.
It's, mate, if quarantine's been good for anything, it's been getting a hold of people that have nothing better to do now.
I squarely fall into that category.
and for those watching the video, we're not going to mention the lumps on Tommy's face. He's been punching himself, all right?
I've been punching myself, walking into fridges and doors. Absolutely no contact was had or made.
No, he's missing it so much. He has to give himself a black eye every now and then, just so he doesn't feel like he's withdrawing or getting soft. Tommy, last time you were on the podcast, we talked about your book, Modern Batitsu, which now that we have the prop in front of us, there you go, on camera for those watching on YouTube. Modern Batitsu, Scientific Street Fighting for Ladies and Gentlemen. Recommend you pick up a copy because it's an excellent book. But you're also kind enough to send me a copy of your next book, which was Shanghai School of Streetfighting, which is all about the Fairbairn and Sykes method of combatives. So I think people really enjoyed last time we were talking about Batitsu, about just learning a bit about the history and the how to and the who to and all those bits and pieces. I mean, most people in the combatives world have heard of the names Fairbairn and Sykes. There'll be an awful lot of people that aren't in the combatives world that haven't heard about those two gentlemen, and there's probably even fewer that really know the history and really know how their method came to be. So let's just provide that platform first about what the background of their system is, who were Fairbairn and Sykes, and how is this program developed?
Okay, perfect. So I'll just take you through a kind of a little potted history of the man. So we'll start with Fairbairn. I mean, Fairbairn is the driving force behind the majority of the unarmed and the bladed stuff. So, people familiar with the name probably are familiar with the knife more than the man or his system. So William Fairbairn, he is an Englishman, and at the age of 15, he joins the Royal Marine Light Infantry, and he gets shipped out to Asia. So he lies about his age, which is fantastic. I think all military history stories start with a man lying about his age to a recruiting sergeant. And he goes off and he gets shipped off to Asia, predominantly on diplomatic duties. So he is guarding embassies. He spends a lot of time in Korea, moving around Asia, but it's predominantly those embassy guarding, ambassadorial kind of roles. And whilst there, he was a fervent advocate, a real interested party in some of the more Western methods of the time. So you imagine that in this period, so from the early 1900s, boxing, wrestling, fencing, bayonet fencing, combat shooting, range shooting, horseback gymnastics. All of these things are very intrinsic to what military people of the time did. And so Fairbairn will have been very, very conversant in those systems, in the boxing, in the wrestling, all of the kind of physical gym culture of the time. And there's some very good accounts in many books, but No Queensberry Rules is one of the better ones. And it talks about kind of interdisciplinary matches, so bayonet fencing with British soldiers and Japanese soldiers, obviously at a time of occupied Korea, and talking about how that worked and how the British soldiers came off worse for wear against the smaller Japanese soldiers in their bayonet fencing. And, soon as it's written in the language of the time, but, soon as we learned the cunning techniques of the Japanese, we soon found ourselves much more equal. So you find very early on that as a military man, Fairbairn, he takes a keen interest in learning from things that he doesn't know about. If he's defeated in something, he learns from it. And that's a big part of his character. So he's a Marine. He's doing these kind of ambassadorial duties, embassy guarding duties. And in 1907, he moves over to the Shanghai Municipal Police. Now, Shanghai at that time is essentially Vice City. It's an international settlement. So inside the international settlement, it's essentially run by business interests and national interests of most of the major colonial powers. So Britain, France, Russia, Japan, and they all have small segments of the city. And managing and looking after the policing of that city was the Shanghai Municipal Police, which is essentially a paramilitary force, so an armed police force. And at that time, from kind of the late 1910s to the 1930s, you've got communists, you've got separatist gangs, you've got huge amounts of drug smuggling, prostitution. You've got to think of it as Chicago on steroids. It is a dangerous, dangerous city, not just from the tongs, from the kind of rising national tensions too, as Japanese interests get much more permanent. And it's in his post in the Shanghai Municipal Police where essentially Fairbairn gets roughed up. He has a very, very bad beating when he runs into what's known as the Green Gang. So a lot of the gangs in Chinese culture are color orientated, the Red Gang, the Green Gang. And he essentially gets himself mullered. And he wakes up after being mullered, and there's a little card on his desk that says he's been healed by a Professor Okada, Jiu-Jitsuka, and Bone Setter. And those of you familiar with judo and jiu-jitsu know that many jiu-jitsu practitioners were also fixers of bones. They were bone doctors. Fairbairn, being very interested in what this jiu-jitsu is, he goes there and he starts to train. And from there, he starts to pick up other arts. Unlikely for people at the time, if you think about some of the racial xenophobia and the sense of superiority, this is still height British Empire. He's going out there and he's learning Japanese jiu-jitsu and judo from the Japanese legation. He's taking time to go learn kung fu and Chinese martial arts. And I think that's very revolutionary because China at this time is, as was known, the sick man of Asia. The martial prowess of the Chinese weren't very celebrated at this time. So for Fairbairn to start to learn Bagua, is a very interesting thing. And he starts to pick up a lot of these fighting systems. And also at this time, he's rising through the ranks, essentially looking after the riot squad of the Shanghai Municipal Police. So as a paramilitary force, he's got access to armories, he's got access to weapon technicians, and he's got access to constables and sergeants from all these different countries, bringing all these different fighting arts together. So Fairbairn soon starts to essentially collate very good martial arts skills in Eastern and Western systems. And because of the control, because he's in such a senior position in a paramilitary police force, he can start to bring things to the fore, such as bulletproof vests, riot shields, one-handed combat shooting, kill houses. He essentially writes the book on what it means to be a modern SWAT team, a modern anti-riot team. So he's essentially in this fantastic time, in this fantastic, I'm hesitant to say playground because it's very dangerous, but this melting pot where he gets the best in bladed, unarmed, and armed urban fighting that nowhere else in the world really has to such a degree. And so Fairbairn, obviously, he melts these things together and he makes some revolutionary changes to how policing is done, from how weapons are held, on what part of the body, what guns are used, how people train, a lot more adrenalized, stress-tested training. But to cut the potted history short, essentially, once he leaves that role, obviously, we start to move into the World War II period, and he gets brought in on the general list, and he starts to get attributed to essentially the commandos, the SOE, and all of those interrelated kind of commando-style units, training people in all manner of things. You know, it's a fantastic time to be, because he's taking his tried and tested skills from the streets of Shanghai, and he's now putting them right into the crucible of war in the special training centers. So special training centers taught irregular warfare. They taught spies, they taught commandos. You know, some of the units taught home guard as well, but predominantly spies, commandos, crack troops. And they're all being taught by William Fairbairn, William Fairbairn's partner, E.A. Sykes, who was very much the shooting side of that relationship. He was a very prolific big game hunter. You know, he took a big portion of designing the knives, deciding which guns, working on the ballistic vests and shields. But together as a partnership, Fairbairn and Sykes, they brought a whole lot to the military table when Britain needed unorthodox warfare the most. You know, when Britain needed that unorthodox style of fighting, that street fighting, that later known as gutter fighting, he was the man with the expert knowledge, and he went and taught that obviously across Britain to the people that needed it, and also went over to Canada, over to the US, and essentially he's the granddaddy of combatives as we know it today. He revolutionized everything from riot vans, bulletproof vests and shields, through to unarmed and armed CQB, CQC.
Yeah, he's got an amazing place in history, and I think a lot of, I guess, a lot of modern combatives practitioners, as I said at the beginning, we probably know the name, but maybe don't realize the revolutionary impact that he had. I mean, it wasn't just that he was the guy who wrote a system or wrote a program, or was, yeah, like these days everyone can say that. Well, not everyone. There's a lot of people that can say they wrote a military unarmed combat program, and a lot of the time, what they've actually written is a Fairbairn and Sykes program with some modern adaptations or their own favorite techniques, or colored or systematized or added to by somewhere else. Before Fairbairn came along, what were the military combatives programs actually looking like? Were they mostly just a combination of boxing and wrestling, or what were they?
In fairness, in World War I, there's actually some very, very, very good material, some phenomenally good material. And often in World War I, it was Sans Jiu-Jitsu. So one of the major differences between World War I and World War II, there is Jiu-Jitsu in the Western world during World War I, but the military was very much in boxing, bayonet fencing, wrestling, dirty tricks in between. And World War I was very, very good at that, and some amazing systems. And I'd be very surprised if Fairbairn didn't riff off some of that material, because there are books, they're not as in-depth as what you would get from a Fairbairn platform, but it's good enough. It's some very good World War I material. But I'd say the major difference is Fairbairn brings in some of the more Asiatic arts. So you'll notice that a lot of the Fairbairn material, a lot of the hands are Kung Fu inspired. There's a lot of claw-based motions. Then you've got, say, your Atemi-waza from your Jiu-Jitsu, a lot of chopping-based motions, edge of hand blows, as he would call them. But very much you can see a lot more jiu-jitsu coming through Fairbairn. You know, as his first and primary set of Asian arts, you can see that coming through. But there's absolutely a brilliant legacy. But after World War One, there doesn't seem to be much appetite in keeping that irregular warfare going. Outside of the fighting that was happening in Ireland with World War One veterans, you know, I'm sure many listeners will be aware of that particular scenario. But outside of that, warfare started to get regular again. It started to become colonial policing. And so, you know, by the time World War II happens, there isn't someone like Fairbairn around. It's very important to say that there are other people at the time, exactly at the same time, doing very much the same stuff. So you've got Pedagogy in Canada, you've got James Hipkiss, who's from my hometown in Birmingham. Most of the videos you see of World War II fighting are actually from James Hipkiss. You know, and it all kind of looks the same. It's all got a kind of boxing, jiu-jitsu flavor to it. You know, they all kind of, a lot of the World War II combatives feel the same. In America, it's very much more judo orientated. They've got what's known as combat judo. So again, that's boxing plus some of the more kind of high damage, high velocity throws of judo. That seems to be more prolific in America. Jiu-jitsu and boxing seem to be more prolific in UK and Europe. But there's many World War II guides out there. Fairbairn's is the most famous, but there are some amazing ones. There's a man called Moshe Feldenkrais who smuggled heavy water in a thermos, heavy water, dangerous material. And he wrote, his World War II combatives book was just called Hadakajime. And it was, you know, for those of you that don't do Japanese arts, strangle. And his entire World War II system is get out of the way, strangle. You know, move the bayonet out of the way, strangle. Jump on his back, strangle. Every move, every single move in his book is just the Hadakajime. You know, it's fantastic. There's some amazing prolific characters all over that World War II matrix. You know, you could spend years reading them. They've all got amazing backstories. It's great material.
Well, I mean, when you've got an environment like World War II, where you've got prolonged international conflict and so many countries involved, either directly or indirectly, where you've got so many people that are getting real world combat experience in close quarters combatives, whether they're on the front line or they're just in the streets, they're getting a lot of exposure. And one thing that happens when you get a whole bunch of people trying to solve the same problem is often the solutions start to look similar. And we even see now, I mean, you look at the evolution of military combatives now. I've been fortunate enough to interview the likes of Matt Larson. I'm familiar with the Australian programs, and a large portion of the material looks a lot like boxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu. I mean, those are the foundational skill sets. As we talked about the last time we chatted about Bartitsu, I mean, those are the foundational skill sets of fighting. And then you can just sort of throw in the particular elements that make up the war zone, or that make up what you're wearing or what equipment you may have access to at the time. So let's have a bit of a look through some of the material. What was Fairbairn? Let's backtrack before we get to the material. Who was he training? Because there's a significant difference between training conscripts who might have a very short onboarding before they're going from the farms to the battlefield, versus professional soldiers or police officers who have more time to dedicate to training. What was his sort of actual exposure there?
So obviously, Fairbairn's kind of life is chunked into chapters. So there's his kind of policing years. So his policing material, his 1915 kind of guides, you know, what his work that he was doing with the Shanghai Municipal Police. You've got a force which is regularly employed and very easy to train because you can regularly train them. And he would have had the time, budget, space to be able to do that very, very well and in an in-depth way. Then he has a civilian period from which we get defended. So he starts to put his material out there for civilians. He's even got a book designed for women's self-defense. So he's got a civilian kind of era. And then he's got his war era. Now, in the war era, you know, you can see there are varying different accounts. But, you know, a lot of people are getting between 6 and 12 hours of this stuff. That's it. In betwixt you learning how to shoot properly, how to do code, how to do all manner of other things, whether it's for intelligence work or whether it's as a shock troop, such as a commando troop. But there's not a huge amount of unarmed material that you'd be doing. It rightly takes up a relatively small part of the curricula, and it's designed to be consumed in that way. One of the differences you'll see is that if you take something like the American Marine combatives programs, the MCMAC or the Army combatives, that is, I'm trying to find the best way to phrase this. It's almost like infotainment, in that they will quite happily and readily say that my job is to make people enjoy this, and therefore getting them doing a bit more BJJ stuff, gripping, wrestling, throwing each other around. It's fun, it's competitive. You've got young testosterone-filled people. If you want them to keep coming back and learning useful stuff, you need a hook. You need a hook to get them going. Whereas the Fairbairn stuff doesn't have that luxury, and he's not obligated to make people happy because they're not really there by a huge amount of choice. So, the curriculum is much, much smaller. It's much more concise. And I would say, to throw that stupid word out there, the pedagogy is different. How you learn. It seems to me that a lot of the modern military combative systems are designed almost to give you a teaser. Come here, get your tan belt, do a bit of jiu-jitsu, get a feel for it, feel competitive, get your mate in an arm bar. That's really fun. And the more you move up, the more it seems to go more combatives. But it starts off a bit more rough and ready and fun, as it should be, as it makes sense. I think the Fairbairn stuff goes for complete concision and retention. And from the off, which is very refreshing for the time, is like, look, you're only going to learn 3 or 4 of these things, so pick the ones that you like and get good at them. And you'll notice that at the start of All In Fighting, they'll be very frank that you're going to ignore or forget most of this, which is a very refreshing outlook from a martial mind. You think of a lot of other books, they're like, with these 100 jiu-jitsu techniques and tricks, you will be unstoppable by any man. The pedagogy, the way of learning is very different. And it's very immersive in that Fairbairn is one of the, Fairbairn and Sykes in their method is one of the first to use proper kill houses, where you go in and you shoot and you stab and you chop and you throw within the confines of what would be house-to-house fighting. If you're thinking about fighting in the Netherlands, or if you're an SOE agent, you're not going to be spending a huge amount of time in an open field. You're going to be scurrying around, hiding things in houses, stealing paperwork. So how the training is contextualized in terms of space and thematics is very different than, I think, a lot more of the more generic and fun, but albeit fantastic, modern methods of today. And that they're just 2 different audiences for 2 different times. But I think one entertains and then educates, and the Fairbairn stuff just educates. It doesn't seem to be a whole lot of fun for people involved. But it works. One of the only accounts we have of an unarmed killing in any theatre of conflict in the modern era is from a woman called Nancy Wake, a Kiwi lady, a Kiwi spy, and she chops an SS guard in the throat, bam, and he dies. It's one of the only accounts we have of a genuine unarmed kill using stuff like this. We very rarely get, even today's technological age, we don't get these accounts anymore. But Nancy Wake, and it's amazing, it's a female, not a particularly tall or powerfully built female, using this stuff in the mix with very good credibility. She's a fascinating woman. If you're listening to this, look up Nancy Wake's story, because she's a badass woman. She's, if I was a school teacher and I was teaching girls history, I'd start with Nancy Wake, because she is cool.
Man, I'm going to have to look into that now. I'm a little bit embarrassed that our neighbouring Kiwis have a figure like her that I haven't heard of. I need to skill myself.
Most of her life, she lived in Sydney, and she lived a very long time. But she spent a lot of time doing stuff in Australia. But she even ran for your parliament. So she ran for a seat in the parliament, and she got cheated of it. And in protest, she left Australia for good.
Normally when Kiwis leave Australia for good, it's because we make them. But I guess the same can be said for the Australians that ended up here from your country. But I'm curious, as you started diving into this material, I mean, we talked at length in the first episode that we did together about your background and your martial lineage, I guess. And we talked about Batitsu. At what point did you really start diving into Defendu or the Shanghai School of Streetfighting material?
So
probably just to add to that question, what point you dove into it, but also as you started getting deep into it and wanting to write a book about it, what were the things that kind of surprised you or that you didn't realize beforehand?
So it's very important to me as someone that loves history and loves martial arts to try and keep it alive for other people to be inspired by it. And I work in the advertising and media industry, and I know how cutthroat people's attention is to stuff, all manner of stuff. And, my granddad was really into this stuff. My granddad was a World War II veteran. My dad really into this stuff. And I always promised both of them one day I would do this. Bartitsu was my first book, and I got the bug for it. But I always promised them I'd do something like this, and I wanted to do it. And I thought the time was good. Lockdown was happening. It's a very good time to write a book. I've always had a very big interest in it personally and in my training. And every luminary in the combatives field has some grounding in this stuff. So if you look at your Kelly McCanns, your Lee Morrisons, all of the major names, or many of the major names, a lot of them are either using some of this stuff, it has been part of their background, they've picked it up from Sestari over in the US, Bob Casper, all of the major names at some point have been using or are still using this stuff. So it's very relevant, it's very current. But I wanted to make something that when a young person picks up the book and picks up the guide, they're captivated by it, gets them interested. Because I used to be a school teacher, and if I was to put one of my pupils in front of this, they would just be like, what is this nonsense? It would not appeal in any way. It's brilliant material. And for a grown man that has a solid interest, you can do everything you want with this. But I wanted to make a book.
Just for those that are listening to the audio, Tommy's holding up a copy of Get Tough, the original. Yeah.
So holding up Get Tough, and even down to his scientific self-defense, even though it has photographs, the average 14 to 21-year-olds not going to find this hugely compelling viewing. And also, a lot of these things are written in a very concise way. It's not like there's resources to spare here. So when he teaches you how to do an edge of hand blow or a chin jab or a throw, it's with the fewest possible words, with the least amount of context, with the least amount of advice, because a lot of this is designed to be trained to you, not really consumed in that media format. So I wanted to make a book that was compelling for all types of people, and to add some flesh on the bones to the material, so contextualize it. So for example, you take something simple like an edge of hand blow, a chop. Now there are ways that you can do that whilst you're grappling. There are ways that you can do that before you're grappling. There's ways that you can do that from the front, from behind, preventing him accessing a weapon. You could take that one technique and really flesh out the probable or likely scenarios. And in modern day, we've got the time and ability to do that. So I take the time to give the techniques a bit more room to flow. You'll also note that in the originals, there isn't much work in flowing the things together. They're taught bam, 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 a bit hip throw, figure four, edge of hand blow, but nothing sequentializes them. And that's very important for a modern learner, because no one thing ever really works by itself. So I wanted to go to good lengths to show, within the realms of reason and with a good critical mind, what flows into what flows into what. And so I took the time to do that. And in the book is material from other authors too, from World War II. So I feed in things from Hip Kiss, from Perigard, from BJ Kosnek, American sources too. So whilst it's primarily about the Fairbairn and Sykes method, I'm bringing their police years together, their military years, and other sources. And I'm just trying to give it an interesting flavor for people. I decided to shoot it in the old gear, again, just to make it visually appealing for people. And it's worked, because I do all of my seminars for free. It's important to me. I have a good enough job as it is that I can do that. I'm fortunate in being able to do that. And I must have done maybe 40, 50 seminars over lockdown of clubs that have never heard of this stuff before. Mostly like karate clubs, Krav Maga clubs, normal clubs doing normal stuff. And I'll be on there and I'll do a 2-hour Zoom, and I'll do, a 90-minute session. And people are picking up a bit of history. they're picking up some techniques, and my main job is to get them to, I'd love them to enjoy the book, but I'm happy for them to just download the free originals, or go look at the great work that Carl Cesari's doing and all these amazing instructors around the world. But I wanted to give it a bit of a gateway drug. What would grab you and put you at peak interest? And I hope that my book is something that does that. It's something that should put a bit of rocket fuel behind people's interest in it. And a lot of the other people writing about this stuff either haven't written for a very long time, or the material isn't particularly media friendly. If you've got to get new people into this stuff. A lot of people that are teaching this now are rather old, and they don't have the abilities to make that content that ensures that today's 10-year-old doing karate grows up and wants to learn how to fight like they did in World War II. For me, it's important that that keeps going.
One thing I always love about both your books is that they're so beautifully presented. So again, for the video content, this is just a page. You can see the quality of the photographs. I don't know how well that's coming across with the lighting, but I mean they're really beautifully shot. Yeah, they seem authentic. I mean, obviously it's been recreated for modern times because you've got nice high definition photos, but it is, as you said, it's a stumbling block for people that want to learn from those original sources. But I mean, as you say, I mean, it was a much different era for printing books. I mean, the ability to take 2,000 photos that would have been a year's work to take that many photos. And then you got to develop them, and you got to see what worked out, and you find, oh Christ, he's got his foot in the wrong spot. And then he's like, well, do we get the whole crew back together to shoot that one photo again, or do we just put it in the book with the foot in the wrong spot, right? And you see these books all the time, and it's when I was younger and more arrogant, I'd look at these books and go, he's not even doing the technique right. But you don't realize the limitations of what it would take. It's not exactly like you can just pull out your iPhone and take the shot again. Yeah. So what you've done there is a fantastic service, not only to I think it's not just a service to modern readers and to modern students, but it's a service to those of old that have something and created something that's worth remembering. And we've just kind of shared our modern privilege in terms of technology and the distribution channels that are available to be able to put more eyes back on that material. And like you say, I mean, if they take your seminar or they read this book and they could decide they need to go buy the originals, or they want to download a PDF of the originals, then at least the material lives on and someone's legacy is being preserved for another generation. And I think what you've done there, both with Shanghai School of Streetfighting and with Modern Bartitsu, it's worthy of commendation as a service to history as much as a service to modern students.
I think we all get very excited about making modern platforms now. A lot of people will buy white labeled Netflix style interfaces with videos, but in 3 years they'll be gone, and in 6 years another one will happen, and then in 9 years that'll be gone. And so for me, it's important, physical media and this kind of stuff is sometimes important. I want to have my grandkids around the fire and show them this stuff, but I have a real big passion for getting people into history and in combatives and in martial arts. And it's quite hard with things like this. I would say with the World War II stuff especially, it can be quite an aggressive community. A lot of people think they own that space, like I trained with him, who trained with him, who trained with him, and it becomes very insular. It's for a small martial community, he's rife with factions, but they're all doing cool stuff. And so for me, I want people to have a look at my book and then go buy his book and then watch his film and go to his seminar. I think that a lot of the existing people that are doing this stuff, they can become very tribal and locked in. And that's unfortunate, but I think it's the nature of having military style martial arts. They do attract some people that have some stranger psychological notions about ownership and control, which is just stupid, really. I feel fairly confident that if Fairbairn was to take a time machine and come back and see my book, he'd be like, cool. I think he'd be happy that people are doing stuff like that. So you've got one of my old instructors, Eddie Quinn, coming on, and for me, if you make people a bit safer and you make them happier, that's the instructor's job. And so that's what I try and do. The books, that a lot of combatives can be too gristly. It's a lot of men that look like an old pie in a leather jacket, scowling and talking about raking people's face in the pavement. And that's cool. There's a massive market for that. But that is an oversaturated market of types of literature. Just because you're doing combative material doesn't mean it can't be enjoyable. You know, you have to make sure you balance the fun with the accurate fighting, you know, and that's what I try and do. I mean, my face is all knocked up. I'm no stranger to hitting people and having lumps hit out of me, but I don't need to walk around like an angry caveman all the time. You should be happy. And I try and put that into my literature, because you will never get young people hooked on these things through sheer testosterone, grit, and terror. There has to be a bit of joy for it to last. There's a reason why karate is as popular as it is. There's a reason Taekwondo is as popular as it is, because it brings people joy. And there's a lot the combatives community can learn from why they make up a small fraction of the martial community. You know, make people happy as you keep them safe, for me, is a big deal. That's what I try and do.
Absolutely. Let's shift gears, just talking about this material and how you can actually go about building competency in it. I mean, it's a beautiful book, but it's still a book, right? So that you don't learn physical skills through reading. You can get ideas, and you can apply those ideas, and it might be a concept in there. You go, what if I tried that with something I do? But if someone's reading this from scratch and they want to really learn the Fairbairn method or you know, the materials in the book, I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me was I was not aware that Fairbairn was the pioneer of kill houses, and I didn't even think of that being an element of World War II, because all the training footage you see from World War II is 1,000 soldiers in a field in lines doing basically line drill. Because look, if you go train 1,000 soldiers, then you're not going to put them all through a kill house. Like it's just not going to be feasible from a time point of view. So it's a handful of techniques all in a line, so an instructor group can quite easily keep an eye on the line and see who's doing the thing that looks different to everyone else, right? There's a reason that exists. But that's most of the footage. So I didn't realize there was that much what we call now scenario training or role play training involved. So I guess actually I'll ask the first question. Was there anything that was a real surprise to you as you started diving deeper into this regarding training methods?
Yeah, it is that methodology. You know, the fact that things like instinctive combat shooting. So in the book Shoot to Live, you see how Fairbairn starts to pioneer one-handed shooting, because you need the other hand to open doors, push people aside, do other stuff with that spare hand. Every other military shooting guide at the time, you know, and there were other people doing the same thought experiment, but Fairbairn is one of the more prolific. You know, he's got, you know, one-handed instinctive shooting from the hip, you know, shooting from kill houses. You know, his books talk about terrain. He's got something called the mad half minute. So the mad half minute is essentially all out fighting for 30 seconds at full intensity and speed, what we'd call today an adrenalized stress test. You know, and you've got written proper decent accounts, third-party verifiable accounts, and there's some very, very good scholars on Fairbairn's material. So there's very good evidence trails for how he went about teaching and how the people he taught went about teaching. But the kill houses, the stress test, the use of dummies, so human dummies like we'd use a bob or a grappling dummy today, scenario-based training, you know, all these types of things are revolutionary for the time. And he was doing that in his own sandbox in Shanghai. So without that Shanghai sandbox, you know, there's no way he could have convinced the British military to take that on board, really. You know, because he could evidence the fact that he policed Shanghai, which is a very dangerous place, in a very good way. He could take that, and you know, essentially that opens up the door for him to start training commandos in that exciting, interesting way. But yeah, the methodologies are fantastic, and he was very much a teach from the front. He was quite theatrical. So one of his tricks was to roll downstairs without being hurt. And bear in mind, at the war, he's quite an old man. So his job would be, A, find the biggest man in the room and battering it. You're a big man like me, so you know what that's like. Every seminar, as soon as you hear the words, you know, even on a much bigger guy, you go, oh, shite, it's going to be me. It's going to be me. Yep. So, you know, he's doing that all the time. All the time. He's fighting and demonstrating in a very rough and ready way. And there's lots of verified accounts of him doing that. He does tricks and stunts to give people confidence. He chucks himself downstairs. He does, you know, rather theatrical gun disarms, because in the 6 hours he's got with you, he wants you to leave, above all else, confident You know, confidence breeds competence. You know, I think he was very, very good at getting people feel like I can mentally do this. Everybody knows that the unarmed portion of any fighting art in war is infinitesimally small. You know, that your need to use it is tiny, but it's one of the only places where you can go all out and make people feel a bit more confident. You think about Nancy Wake. You know, Nancy Wake wouldn't have boxed before or done judo or wrestled. You know, you can take a hard-ass commando from Glasgow and he doesn't need much confidence building to know he's a tough dude. But someone like Nancy Wake, she speaks good French. She's Kiwi, you know, she's got decent gumption about her, but she doesn't have much fighting skills. And he's got to convince her that she can do the job. And in one chop, she did the job. She killed an SS guard. You know, I don't think it's the chop that really did the job. It's the confidence that did the job. And I think that's what he was very good at doing, building confidence so you felt ready. And I feel that that's a big part of the man's legacy is the psychological conditioning, the training, the relevance, the reality of it. But you know, these are tough guys, and he's focusing more on their mind than their physical skills, I feel. And that's why his books say, learn 4 things, forget the rest, crack on. And I like that.
Yeah, it's that's also something that I hadn't really. I guess I probably glossed over as I've read Fairbairn's material over the years, is the isolating down to a handful of techniques, because all these manuals, like you say, I mean, the manuals were typically written for an instructor group to be able to teach, as opposed to a student to learn, and therefore, like, you open up a book that has 40 techniques in it, and you're like, is anyone going to learn anything? Because if by the time you've read 40 techniques, or you've looked at pictures of 40 techniques, like you basically don't remember anything except the last 10 that you saw, maybe. Or if there was something that was like, with a bit of experience, you might have, well, that one was interesting. That's an avenue I hadn't looked at before, or that's similar to something else that I've seen before. With a bit of experience, you can kind of cull those out. But I didn't realize that Fairbairn had actually built that in and was consciously promoting that you're not going to remember everything, which is great, because I mean that's it's something modern martial arts instructors still struggle with. It's you go to a seminar and someone teaches you 15 techniques and you're like, well, that was fun and entertaining, but I don't know that I actually got any better.
And he's delightfully honest. You know, the opening portions of his All In Fighting are, you know, he says something along the lines of, I'll never disagree with the great things that can be achieved with a boxer's right cross or a rugby tackle. He talks about rugby, you know, and he's like, you know, so he's acknowledging that boxing makes you hard as fuck and rugby makes you hard, you know, and he's not saying that these things are bad, you know, which is quite, you know, you get a lot of modern people in this reality game that say, oh, I would never punch a man with my bare hands. It would shatter into a billion fragments. You know, you get like this really partisan combatives or sporting environments, and Fairbairn, quite right, he's like, no, there's good stuff on both, just do both, it's cool. You know, and that's very much my philosophy as well. You know, I think there's too much, I'm in this crowd or this crowd or this crowd, but yeah, I think he's a luminary man in that he took the time to learn those skills. If you think about his history, you know, 1930s, right? China is feeling horribly oppressed, repressed, and ripped apart. And he's still managing to learn Kung Fu from a Chinese man. He doesn't have to teach him Kung Fu. At the time where Japan knows it's about to kick off and take half the British Eastern Empire away from him, he's learning judo and jiu-jitsu from Japanese people. You know, I think his earnest approach, just wanting to learn and loving martial arts, opened doors that should have been closed. Culturally, socially, economically, should have been closed. But his open nature in, you know, I may head up the Shanghai Municipal Police, but I'm coming to your Kwun or your dojo and I'm just a man that's learning. Yeah, that attitude is to be hugely applauded. And it's an amazing thing of his time and of his age and of his culture that was happening. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. All right, just to come back to the question I started to ask, and then interrupted myself with a different question, because people say, you're such a great interviewer, if only you knew. I'm curious from a training point of view, if someone is a practicing martial artist, or they do some sort of combative system and they want to learn some more of this material, they've only got your book to go by, how do you recommend they integrate it within their training programs, or how do you recommend they practice these techniques?
Oh, yeah. One of the main things, anyone that's ever written a martial arts book will get comments like, you can't learn fighting from books. And it's like, I know that. It's to help you. So, you know, like, I don't expect, you know, you're not on a desert island. You've not gone to a desert island with just my book. You know, I fully expect, and I would want people to go to boxing gyms and judo dojos and engage in the rich tapestry of martial arts. So for me, it's, you know, it's more designed for someone that knows a bit of martial arts or has an appetite to learn more martial arts. And luckily, the things that are in the Fairbairn syllabus, you can go to any town, anywhere in the world, and you can definitely do some judo. You can definitely do some boxing. And odds are, at least in the next town, there'll be some kung fu and some jujitsu. You know, these things are accessible, hugely accessible arts everywhere. And so if you wanted to go down a very purist path, you would go down and you'd learn good things about those arts. And then you might come back over years and years and years and pick up different bits of the book. And every time you study something a bit new, you might feel a different flavor in the book. You know, your experience, let's say you've only done judo, you'll pick up the bits of this book and you'll immediately go, oh, judo, judo, judo. Whereas if you just did jujitsu, you go, ah, bit of jits, bit of jits. You know, if you just did kung fu, you'd be like, ah, that tiger palm. You know, you take out from it your experiences. So I wouldn't encourage anybody to just learn from my book. I'd encourage them to go to their nearest boxing club and their judo club, get hit and slammed and thrown like everyone else, and put in the work. The book is an extra element for you to add more interesting things to your techniques, or just see how they were done and how they were packaged. You know, there are some clubs around the world that do just teach this, that do just teach Fairbairn style defender, and that's really cool. But I'm not blinkered enough to think that that makes up a sufficient holistic diet for martial knowledge now. You know, I would never be as vain or as proud to say, as much as I love everything that's in my book and it's in Fairbairn's books, it's not enough now. You know, you need the soft skills, you need the awareness, you need to know these. You don't need, but they're beneficial. It's beneficial to know these things. And it's the era of choice for martial artists. So take a bit of Fairbairn, take a bit of boxing, do some jiu-jitsu. That's what Fairbairn would have done. You know, everything I know about Fairbairn the man would tell me that if he were alive today, he would get himself down to an MMA gym and a BJJ gym and probably a Krav Maga club. And he would go learn this stuff. So for me, you know, take the book, enjoy it, play with it, do techniques with your classes. You know, ideally, don't just use it if you've never done anything before. But if you have done nothing before, but this is the only thing that appeals, that's cool. You know, it's not rocket science. So yes, of course, you could pick this up and self-train to some degree, but you'll always be less effective than someone that's gone and done proper rounds. And I don't think anyone that's ever written a martial arts book has ever really thought this is the only thing you'll need, the pill that cures all ills. But it is something that gets thrown a lot at martial arts authors, and it's very damning. It's very off-putting. I think a lot of people could write some very good books if people were more kind to people that made content. You know, people are horribly abusive to anyone that makes any type of martial arts content. Horribly abusive. It's one of the worst sports or cultures, I think, in everything. People are very, 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 very horrible to each other. And so there are a lot of people that are sat on some very good knowledge that do very little because of, you know, oh, you can't do this from a book, or, you know, you can't do this because you haven't trained with this specific person. I don't think Fairbairn would think that way. I think he would say, learn with as many people as you can, and if it works for you, cool. You know, that's my approach to things. I think that would have been an approach of him as well. There's nothing that tells me he would think or speak otherwise. And that's where I go about it. You know, take a book or take a martial arts subscription with the appropriate grain of salt it needs, and use your very adult brain. I always say to people, come from a boxing background, you know, protect yourself at all times and defend yourself at all times. That's not just in what you choose to, how you choose to fight, but how you choose to train. You know, protect yourself at all times. Get yourself looking at the soft skills, the awareness, the other clubs. See what the other people are doing. But it's always your responsibility. It's not the coach. It's not the ref. It's your responsibility to protect yourself. So if you're fooling yourself into thinking just a book or a DVD or a seminar or any one club cures all of that, you'd be very misguided. But they are great tools to pick up. You know, you should. Every good martial artist I know, you know, reads regularly. and reads well and reads broadly. There is no good person. Think about your podcasts, bedecked full of the best shining lights and combatives. Isn't no one telling me that Rory Miller, Kelly McCann, Lee Morrison don't have a hugely stocked library of very good material? So, if you want to be good, your mind dojo has to be on point. You need to read and engage, and your mind game needs to be as good as your physical game. And I think the best in the field take a lot of time to appreciate written literature for what it brings to the table and what it doesn't.
Yeah, and for those that are Patreon contributors, you'll know that one of the bonus questions I ask every guest is, what is the one book that you'd consider essential reading on this topic? And it is probably the most agonizing question for every single guest, even those that are not considered to be intellectuals of the field, that are physical skills instructors and not academics necessarily, but they all struggle to get it under 3 to 4 books because they all have a library of sources, because you don't get to be a world leader or a thought leader in a particular area without reading widely and seeing what other people are doing. And even if it's just within your niche, even if you're just a karate practitioner, you probably have a shelf full of karate books. Even if you're not interested, if you just dedicate yourself to one particular focus, or you're a shooting instructor, like, you'll have so many books on shooting and probably first aid and a couple other like fringe areas of that are related to your skill set. But yeah, I mean, every single guest is an avid reader. I've never had anyone that I have interviewed say, I'm not really a reader. Like, it's just never happened. So I highly encourage you to, if you're not a reader, go pick up the books. There's a reading list on my bloody website that has 60 books to get you started. So go do that. But speaking of books, Tommy, I know you self-published these books. You paid for the printing. You got absolutely pillaged on the shipping, sending them all over the world. Made $0 because you're a philanthropist, perhaps accidentally. But if people want to get a copy of Shanghai School of Streetfighting, what's the best way for them to do that?
Okay, so first of all, if you are ex-forces, you can get it for free. So find me on Facebook, just type in Tommy Joe Moore, drop me a message. Please don't take the piss. But yes, absolutely. So if you're ex-forces, you get one for free. If you're not and you would like to buy one, if you type in Shanghai School of Streetfighting, you can find them on eBay. And if you struggle with that, just message me and we can arrange it via PayPal. But Facebook is the easiest platform for most people, but you can buy them directly off eBay. I try not to put things on Amazon if I can help it. I've got some qualms about their business model, their operating model. So I do my best. But eventually, when I do run out of print copies, I will then have it on print on demand on Amazon. So you can either wait about a year and you can pick it up there, or eBay it now, or Facebook me now. And I will always help and do my best to unite people with some stuff. But even if people don't want this but want to know what books I read to make this, then just get in touch. I will always happily discuss anything with anyone.
Brilliant, mate. Thank you so much for your time. You're going to stick around and do a little bit of bonus content for us. But for those that are leaving us here, I just want to thank you once again for sharing your amazing knowledge, your teaching skills. Your love of this is apparent. Your love of the history, your love of the martial arts it's infectious. We have very, very much in common, not just a ginger beard. So I appreciate you making the time to come back on the show.
Cheers, fella. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you once again to Tommy J. Moore. Always entertaining. His passion is infectious. He's such a great teacher and he's such a great guy to talk to. It's a pleasure to have him on the show. And speaking of great teachers, next week we have the one and only Eddie Quinn. Eddie is another POM, another one from the UK. We've been inundated with guests from the UK of late, but high quality martial artists and high quality instructors. Eddie Quinn is renowned as one of the greatest teachers in the martial arts and combatives world, and it is great to have Eddie on the podcast. Long overdue, but much requested. So looking forward to that. Don't forget, if you want bonus content from Tommy and all our previous guests, head on over to Managing Violence on Patreon, patreon.com/Managing Violence. Until then, I'll talk to you next time.